I have spent most of my life watching people misunderstand money because they keep staring at the object instead of the system around the object. They hold up a dollar bill and ask why it has value. That is the wrong question. The paper itself has almost no value. The ink has almost no value. The design, the portrait, the texture, none of that explains why the whole world has spent decades treating the dollar as if it were a kind of secular scripture. The real reason was never the paper. It was the demand created by taxes, demand created by debt, demand created by trade, demand created by the military, the legal system, the banking system, and, most importantly, by the architecture of global energy. That is what people miss when they talk casually about de-dollarization. They think it means some rival currency will suddenly replace the dollar in one glorious moment. That is not how this works. Reserve currency privilege does not disappear like a light switch turning off. It fades because fewer people need the currency as badly as they once did, and once that need weakens, the privilege begins to leak away. That is what I think is happening. Now, the dangerous thing is not that the dollar disappears tomorrow. The dangerous thing is that the dollar can remain dominant while still becoming weaker in all the ways that matter to an ordinary American family. That is how empires decline financially, not with one ceremonial ending, with a long stretch where the ruling population keeps thinking. It still has the old privilege, even as prices, interest rates, debt service, and purchasing power begin telling a less flattering story to understand why this matters. You have to understand what the petrodollar really was. Back in the 1970s, after the gold window had been closed and the United States could no longer pretend the dollar was anchored honestly to metal, a new anchor had to be found. The answer was oil. Saudi Arabia and other major producers would price oil in dollars. If the world needed oil, and the world always needed oil, then the world needed dollars. If central banks and governments needed dollars for trade, then they also needed somewhere to store those dollars. The natural parking place became U.S. Treasuries that created one of the most extraordinary financial arrangements in modern history. America could run deficits more easily. America could borrow more cheaply. America could issue more debt than almost any other country could get away with. And because global demand for dollars and treasuries was so persistent, the burden of American fiscal excess was softened by the rest of the world. This was not free money in the childish sense. It was better than that. It was structural demand. And structural demand is one of the most valuable privileges any nation can possess. Now think about what happens if that demand begins to erode. Not vanish, erode. If fewer countries insist on holding dollars, if fewer energy trades require dollars, if more trade is settled in local currencies, if more official reserves are moved into gold, if central banks start looking at treasuries and seeing not pristine safety, but exposure to a country that borrows too much, sanctions too casually, and prints too often, then the first consequence is not a dramatic collapse. The first consequence is less automatic support for the dollar system. And that matters because America has become used to being financed on unusually generous terms. The United States government is now carrying debt on a scale that only works smoothly if the world keeps treating us obligations as nearly sacred. But debt is not sacred. It is a promise. And promises become more expensive when the lender begins to suspect that repayment will arrive in money worth less than expected. That is where we are headed. Now, I want to be careful here. The dollar is still the dominant global currency. Most international trade is still routed through it. Most commodity pricing is still linked to it. Most of the old system still stands. But systems do not have to vanish to become less useful to the people living inside them. That is the practical danger. The process is what matters, and the process has already begun. More bilateral trade deals are happening outside the dollar. More countries are experimenting with alternative settlement systems. More governments are openly discussing reducing their exposure to dollar reserves. And the most important signal of all is not what they say. It is what they do with their savings. For the first time in decades, gold has overtaken U.S. Treasuries in global central bank reserve allocation. That should stop any thoughtful person in his tracks. Think about what that means. The very institutions closest to the fiat money machine are choosing to hold more metal and relatively fewer promises issued by Washington. That is not a small mood swing. That is a reserve judgment. And reserve judgments matter because they tell you what the system's insiders trust when they are no longer speaking in public relations language. Now let us ask the obvious question, why is this happening? There are many reasons, but the largest are not hard to understand. The first is weaponization. When the United States froze Russian reserves after the invasion of Ukraine, it sent a message far beyond Russia. From a policy perspective, one can debate whether the move was justified. That is not my subject here. My subject is what the rest of the world learned from it. And what the rest of the world learned was simple. If your reserves are held in the dollar system, your savings are not fully yours. They remain yours only as long as Washington finds your behavior acceptable. That realization changes incentives. If you are another country, maybe not hostile to America, but not eager to discover how much power America holds over your reserves, then the lesson is obvious. Diversify, reduce exposure, build alternatives, hold more of what cannot be frozen by a keystroke. That is how sanctions accelerate de-dollarization. The second reason is fiscal irresponsibility. I do not use that phrase lightly. I use it because the arithmetic has become impossible to describe honestly any other way. The United States is not merely borrowing a lot. It is structurally overspending by trillions. A government that collects roughly $5 trillion and spends roughly $7 is not making a temporary adjustment. It is living on a system that requires endless refinancing, endless issuance, and endless faith that there will always be enough buyers willing to lend on acceptable terms. That is not a stable foundation. And every new debt issue requires demand. Every new auction requires lenders. Every new year of overspending increases the future burden. If foreign buyers want fewer treasuries than before, that means someone else must absorb the supply. Private domestic buyers, banks, money market funds, the Federal Reserve by indirect or direct means, however you route it, the implication is the same. If automatic foreign demand weakens, funding gets harder. And when funding gets harder, yields eventually go higher. That is how de-dollarization reaches Main Street, not as a philosophy seminar. As higher rates, higher mortgage rates, higher auto loan rates, higher financing costs across the economy, and over time, a lower standard of living because a weaker reserve position means the dollar buys less privilege than it used to. The third reason is money printing. Now, I know people use that phrase too loosely. Not every liquidity facility is identical. Not every balance sheet expansion looks the same. But if a government keeps overspending and a central bank keeps helping the system tolerate that overspending by absorbing shocks, backstopping markets, or making it easier for debt to roll forward, then outsiders eventually notice something important. They are lending into a system that increasingly solves every problem with more paper claims. And paper claims are wonderful until too many of them exist. This is why America's debt and money problem are connected. If the debt cannot be paid back honestly through growth and discipline, then in practice it will be paid back in dollars. Let's command this. That is not a theory. That is how over-indebted systems behave. Now look at what happens if you are another country holding treasuries as reserves. You are lending to a government that overspends structurally, finances itself increasingly by issuance, and may choose inflation over austerity whenever the political pressure grows too intense. Why would you want all your savings there if alternatives exist? That is the question central banks are answering. And the answer increasingly is that they do not. Now let us bring Iran into the picture because this is where the public often confuses geopolitics with energy and misses the monetary layer underneath both. When oil is sold outside the dollar, the transaction does not merely bypass one currency. It bypasses the recycling mechanism that helps support the old order. Under the classic arrangement, oil sold for dollars produced dollar surpluses, and those surpluses often found their way into dollar assets, especially treasuries. That was the loop. But if oil is sold for yuan and the seller then uses yuan to buy Chinese machinery, equipment, steel, electronics, chemicals, or defense goods, the loop changes. The money does not come back to support American assets. It circulates elsewhere. This is why Washington cares so much about what currency energy is sold in. It is not symbolic, it is demand routing. The United States wanted a world in which the global energy bill reinforced the dollar system. Increasingly, parts of the world are experimenting with arrangements where it does not. That does not end the dollar overnight. It weakens the automaticity of its demand. And once demand becomes less automatic, the burden of persuasion grows. America must offer more yield, more incentives, more financial engineering, more confidence management. That is the cost of a weakening reserve monopoly. Now, a lot of people hear all this and conclude the dollar will crash tomorrow. Treasuries will become worthless, and gold is the only thing left. That is not how I think. I do not believe in melodrama as a substitute for analysis. The dollar can weaken for years before the public fully understands what is happening. Treasuries can still function while becoming less attractive. The old system can remain in place while becoming less generous to Americans. That is the true danger, because gradual decline is much easier to normalize than sudden collapse. If your money buys a little less each year, if your financing costs rise a little more each cycle, if asset ownership keeps outrunning wage growth, then the national story can still sound stable while the lived reality quietly deteriorates. That is how standards of living fall in advanced countries, respectively. Now let me say the part that matters most for the individual investor. If the process of de-dollarization continues, then the old assumption that cash and treasuries are the default safe answers becomes weaker. Not necessarily wrong in every short-term tactical context, but weaker because cash is a direct claim on the currency and treasuries are a delayed claim on the currency. If the currency itself is losing relative privilege, then simply sitting passively in nominal instruments is not prudence. It is exposure. That is why I think gold matters. Not because it is exciting, not because it produces cash flow, not because it will replace every other asset, but because when central banks themselves are shifting demand toward gold, they are telling you that one of the few things they trust in a world of overissued promises is the thing that cannot be printed by policy committee. That matters. Gold is not some mystical relic. It is monetary memory. It is what institutions return to when they begin doubting the long-term reliability of political paper. That does not tend to diversification, but if the world is genuinely moving toward less dollar dependence, then I think it is entirely reasonable to own a meaningful allocation to what the central banks themselves are accumulating. That can mean physical metal. It can mean gold-related securities. It can mean miners, royalty businesses, or streaming companies, if one understands the risks. The point is not the exact vehicle. The point is to stop pretending that the privilege of the dollar system can erode without affecting how an intelligent person protects purchasing power. Now, I also want to make something else very clear. De-dollarization is not only a gold story, it is also a hard asset story, a real asset story, an ownership story. If the dollar buys less over time, then the people who own scarce things, productive things, and repriceable things are likely to fare better than the people who only hold nominal claims. That includes some businesses, some real estate, some commodity exposure, some international assets. The right kind of equity can defend purchasing power far better than obedient cash balances. This is why I always return to the same distinction. Consumers save money. Owners save in assets. That distinction becomes more important, not less. When the reserve currency begins losing some of its old automatic support, the average American still behaves as though the dollar will always command what it used to command. I think that is a dangerous assumption, because even a mild but persistent weakening in global dollar demand can change everything that matters domestically: inflation rates, debt service, housing affordability, wage purchasing power, portfolio construction, retirement assumptions, all of it. That is why I do not think this subject is niche. It is not some exotic geopolitical hobby. It is the architecture beneath future living standards. If the dollar's exceptional demand weakens, Americans will eventually feel that through a more expensive life and a less forgiving financial system. That is the blunt truth. Now, I do not say that to frighten anybody. I say it because the earlier a person understands the process, the more options he still has. Once de-dollarization is obvious to everyone, the easy protection has usually already become expensive. That is why I would rather watch what central banks are doing now than listen to what politicians say later. I would rather respect the signal in reserve shifts than wait for the headline in consumer pain. I would rather own some of what benefits from a weaker dollar than assume the old system will protect passive savers forever. That is not doom. It is adjustment. And in a world where the petrodollar order is being challenged piece by piece, adjustment is what serious people do before the crowd calls the process inevitable.